All right, everyone, we are live, and if you're joining us via podcast, we are here. Thank you for making us a part of your day. Today, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Josh Bowen. We're going to be talking about his journey from Christianity to agnosticism, and we're going to be talking about some questions regarding his view of the Old Testament from his perspective, from his research, a lot of good things. There's a long bio and description if you want to read about Dr. Josh, but he graduated from Johns Hopkins University in 2016 with a Ph.D. in Assyriology. That's all I'll cover. But I mean, for people who, we'll just start with this. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Josh. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm really looking forward to this. So just to start off, for people who do not know who you are, Dr. Josh Bowen, what could you say a little bit about who you are, what you do with like the digital Hammurabi? What's the correct pronunciation of that?
Hammurabi. You got
Hammurabi.
it. You got it.
All right, I'm trying. So just talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, things like that.
Sure. Yeah. So what to say? I got my master's degree in theology. I got a THM in Old Testament studies from Capital Bible Seminary in 2009. And then I went to Johns Hopkins and I minored in Hebrew Bible and got my PhD in Assyriology. So I studied ancient Iraq, the languages and cultures of ancient Iraq. So I learned Sumerian and Akkadian, which was a lot of fun. And once I graduated, life changed a bit. And so my wife and I, Megan, were sort of forced into leaving the academic world, which was unfun, but it opened up this door to start a YouTube channel called Digital Hammurabi. And essentially what we do is we try to bring the ancient world, ancient Near East, Hebrew Bible, all that stuff to non-specialists. And so that's what we do, make videos and do fun interviews like this. And I'm sure I put my foot in my mouth any number of times, but hopefully that won't happen too much tonight. So,
well, I mean, I appreciate you being willing to come out here and not be afraid to just kind of say what you believe. And I respect you a lot for that. Always appreciated that from what I've seen from you. So what got you interested in all of these, like in studying the ancient Near East, languages in the ancient Near East, things along those lines?
Yeah, so I won't go into a whole bunch of detail, but I was a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, 25 years, 26 years. And so, when I joined the Air Force, I immediately started taking classes to try to get my bachelor's degree in religion, and I wanted to become a chaplain, an Air Force chaplain. So, that road took me down to seminary. So when I got to seminary, I knew I had to learn Greek and Hebrew. So I started studying Greek. And I don't know why I do this, but I tend to take the road less traveled. It might be because of curiosity. It's probably more because of fear. But I always wanted to do things that fewer people were doing. Mm-hmm. So I studied Greek, but then when I had the chance to study Hebrew, I started studying Hebrew because fewer people study Hebrew. And then started studying Aramaic. And then when I graduated from Capital Bible Seminary, I started studying at Hopkins and started doing Akkadian. But then I did Sumerian instead of Akkadian because fewer people do Sumerian. But all of that was driven by I wanted to be the best Old Testament scholar that I could possibly be because I thought there were a lot of people that there were a lot of people in my denomination in particular, which was sort of a Baptist spinoff denomination, that, could really do with a good dose of understanding some of the deeper aspects of the biblical text. So I wanted to go so that I could shore up people's faiths, and really ultimately be a good pastor. So that's what drove me getting into Hopkins. So
yeah. So this is a good transition. So for those of you listening, we're kind of going to do this in two parts. The first part, or three parts. The first part is just going to be talking about Dr. Josh and kind of his deconversion from Christianity and kind of where he's at now regarding his beliefs. The second part will be kind of looking at some Old Testament questions, Old Testament views from his perspective, and then we may do a little bit of audience Q&A if time allows. But I mean, we'll dive into this first part, and let's just start off with, I mean, so you're an agnostic now. So I'm curious, what does it mean to you that you are an agnostic?
Yeah, I mean, I know this debate, particularly on social media, about what it means to be an agnostic versus an atheist, and obviously that can be a very interesting discussion for other people. I'm not terribly philosophically minded, so I would say that if somebody had to define me, when people ask me, "Do you believe in God?" No. Do you know that there's not a God? No. So I feel like that puts me pretty square in an agnostic camp. But I guess some people would define me as an atheist because I don't believe in God. I lack belief in God. But yeah, that's really what it means to me, is that I haven't seen convincing evidence for the existence of God. But I'm not really torn one way or another about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, I mean, I think a lot of people can try to put people in like, oh, if you just lack a belief, almost as it seems like for you, then you have to be an atheist or something like that. But I'm guessing for you, that's not really a priority, trying to figure out like what exactly your definition is and what term it fits into.
Yeah, not really. I mean, I'm not saying that those aren't important questions, but it's like cooking. Like cooking is a really important thing to do, but I'm very blessed that I have Megan as my wife, because I have no interest in it whatsoever. So sort of the same thing, I guess.
Yeah, fair enough. So just to start off a little bit here, you talked a little bit about this idea of you being a fundamentalist Christian. You talked a little bit earlier also about fundamental Christianity. So when you bring up the term fundamental Christianity, what did you believe specifically, and kind of like what do you see fundamental Christianity as?
Sure. So, I mean, first and foremost, I mean, I guess I know this will be, basic to everybody listening, but, in your audience, but, I knew that I was a sinner, and I wasn't a sinner because I sinned. I was a sinner because I was, in Adam. I had a sin nature, and because of that, with respect to a holy God, there was no way that I could enter into his kingdom because of that sin nature that I had. And I recognized that the penalty for that sin was death, separation from God and for all eternity, but that Christ had come and died on the cross, not only for all humankind, but for me specifically, and that if I trusted in his finished work on the cross, that I would have my sins forgiven. I'd be fully justified. So that free gift of salvation was accepted, and I trusted Christ for my salvation. And I did that at a very early age. Probably 6. I grew up with my grandparents, and of course my parents, but my grandparents in particular were a very strong influence on me spiritually. And, so my life was, at its core, was faith in Christ. And, every move that I made, every decision that I made, I tried to think, what is it that God would have me to do here? So when I say fundamentalist, what I believe in the verbal plenary inspiration of the scriptures, that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, down to the grammatical forms, right? So I didn't really think about it as deeply until I got to seminary. But once I did, then it was a question of, where does inerrancy, where did it extend? Did it extend to the manuscripts? Did it only go back to the autographs? Those sorts of questions I began to wrestle with. But, the Bible was the infallible, inspired, inerrant word of God. And it was preserved supernaturally by him. And so, what that meant for me in the places that I thought about it, and when I say that, I mean, I didn't think an awful lot about things like evolution and does evolution square with Genesis and those sorts of questions. I was always able to kind of, and please, Zach, if I start rambling on, just tell me to be quiet. You're
all good, man. I'm here to listen to you. Just ramble on as much as you want to.
I didn't really think too terribly much about scientific aspects of the inerrancy of the text, primarily because I thought things like, well, when Adam and Eve were created, they were created with apparent age, right? So they weren't born looking like they weren't created looking like they were 2 seconds old. They probably look like they were in their 30s. And so if they were born with apparent age like that, then the rest of the universe, could be created with apparent age. And so, of course, if you dug down and looked at the rocks, it would look like it was millions or billions of years old. And it's because God created it that way. And the stars, we just have light reaching us now. Not that I thought about that, but it's because God created it that way with apparent age. If you cut down a tree in the Garden of Eden, it would have rings, right? I mean, that was my thought. And that, I'm sure you want to talk about, I'll save that for later, but that's sort of that fundamental, so that's what I mean by that, a fundamentalist approach, the inerrancy of the scriptures, and the infallibility of the word of God. And I really, outside of like poetry, in the Psalms or wisdom literature, if we want to still call it that, in the Proverbs, outside of that, from a historical grammatical standpoint, I really didn't do a lot of genre differentiation in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. So if it said that God created in 7 days or 6 days and rested on the seventh, that was what happened. Six days of creation, literal days. So that was my understanding of the biblical text. That was my hermeneutic, I guess.
Okay, yeah. So could you talk a little bit about your life as a Christian, kind of leading up to the point of your deconversion? Like, I know you talked a little bit, you were in the Air Force, you wanted to be a chaplain, you're trying to follow God, things like that. So what did your faith look like? Was it like you were actively involved in like Bible studies and churches and things like that? And like, did your beliefs about Christianity kind of change as you approached this period where you eventually deconverted, things like that? So what did your faith look like during this time?
Yeah, so I was called Jesus boy throughout middle and high school because there were just things I wasn't going to do. Right, I got beat up a lot in high school, and in late middle school because I didn't think it was the right thing to fight back. It was and I was, I guess, youth group was a huge thing for me really throughout the entirety of my middle and high school time. So we had a ministry where we would go out and present the gospel to people. I did a mission trip to Mexico. But it was all about presenting the gospel and winning others to Christ. And when I joined the Air Force when I was 17, and I remember witnessing to people in basic training, which was not terribly popular. They had other things on their minds. But as soon as I got to Dover Air Force Base, which was my first duty station, I immediately started a Bible study of my own. I was a dispensationalist, if that means anything to you. But I was a mid-acts dispensationalist, so I knew better than everybody else that was a dispensationalist. And if you don't know what dispensationalism is, that's probably not funny. But the biblical text was really, really important to me. So I read a lot from authors. I read a lot of authors in my denomination. There was a guy named C.R. Stam, somebody who was a little more controversial, named Keith Blades. But I read the biblical text a lot. I wrote a commentary on the book of Acts, which looked a lot like a commentary that I had read. It says, how that is. You understand a passage and then you write a commentary on it, or you write something on it. It seems like you're just channeling the commentaries that you've read. But that's what it looked like, But yeah, so the gospel was it foremost in my life. So when I got commissioned as a second lieutenant in 2003 and started seminary at Capital Bible Seminary, and I knew everything when I started seminary. I knew everything. I felt sorry for my professors because I knew so much. I'm rolling my eyes for people on the podcast, because I didn't know anything. But started studying Greek, started studying Hebrew. and realized pretty quickly that my very narrow denominational understanding was, I still was a dispensationalist, but not a mid-acts dispensationalist. Anyway, but I remember I was in seminary for 6 years, got my THM, and I taught Hebrew for the last 2 years that I was there. And I somehow got accepted to Johns Hopkins in the Assyriology program. And when I found out, it was I remember having a conversation the last semester that I was teaching and writing my thesis. I had a conversation with the dean, and he stopped me on the way out teaching a class, and he said, "So Hopkins is a pretty liberal place, Are you ready?" And I remember I had my Hebrew Bible with me, but I held it up, and I'll never forget it. I held my Hebrew Bible up, and I said, "I'm going into the lion's den, but I'm going to win souls for Christ." Mm. And I really, that's how I went into Hopkins. And it was so apparent, apparently, going in, that I remember, I won't mention his name, but a really good friend of mine that was several years ahead of me in the program at Hopkins said to me, "So how long do you think your fundamentalism, how long do you think your evangelical faith is going to last?" And I said, hold on, man, because you're not taking it away from me. And he kind of chuckled and he said, "We'll see," which, looking back, was not the nicest thing in the world to say to me. But that was that's what life was like leading up to it. It was who I was.
So heading into Hopkins, you're an evangelical. Did you hold to some of those fundamentalist beliefs, such as like a young Earth view and things like that, still when you were, after you'd gone through seminary?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, not that. So the seminary that I went to was a fundamentalist seminary. So Professor Todd Beale, he was part of a conference with John Collins and I think Richard Averbeck, and there were a couple other guys, and they were looking at Genesis 1 through 11. And Todd Beale was the conservative on that panel, so he held to a very literal view of Genesis 1, for example, 7 days of creation are 7 literal days. Whereas, and there was a literal Adam and Eve, and it was, further 6,000 years old. So, while there was some flexibility, I suppose, in that with the other members of the panel, they were all evangelicals, all members of the ETS. But my school was very much, I think, in that way. And again, I'm not scientifically minded, so those types of things, like a young Earth, wasn't really problematic for me. It was more the historical aspects. So, the conquest accounts, how does that square with the early chapters of Judges? Those were the questions that I wrestled with, but had good answers. I thought I had pretty good answers for those things going in. So,
yeah. And as we build up to this, I'm curious. So now, can you talk a little bit about your deconversion from Christianity? Like, what were some of the things that caused you to doubt your faith, which eventually led to you leaving Christianity? And yeah, we'll just start with that and just talk about that.
Yeah, and before I do, I don't want anybody listening or anybody watching to think that my goal here is to somehow cause doubt or anything, or bring anybody's faith. That's my wife is a Christian, in case anybody doesn't know that. So that's not my point here whatsoever. So I hope it doesn't come across that way. And anything that I say, Zach, please feel free to challenge me on. That's absolutely fine. But for me, given my very fundamentalist background, I took, amongst the other many courses that I took my first semester at Hopkins, there's a 3-year cycle that everybody goes. So you have 3 years of coursework at Hopkins before you start writing your dissertation. Excuse me. And each year there's a history cycle. So there's Syro-Palestinian history one year, then the next year is Egyptian history, then the last year is Mesopotamian history. And I happened to come in on the Syro-Pal, the history of Syro-Palestine. And I just remember, we had to read probably 1,000 pages a week of articles and monographs, those sorts of things, to come into class each week for a discussion. And I remember reading through these articles and these books and learning about the Amarna period, in the 14th century, or learning about the Bronze Age, late Bronze Age collapse, or learning about the Philistines. And I don't know that there was any one thing necessarily. I remember the Philistines stuck out. I had to write a paper on the Philistines. And as I wrote it, I just thought, geez, this just doesn't seem to match up with what the biblical texts say. And that was, if there was one thing that stands out, it was the Philistines. But, it was just going through this course. And at the same time, I'm beginning to read Akkadian and Sumerian literature, right? And Zach, I don't know how much you get into this stuff, but if you read through the Genesis flood story, for example, in 6 through 9, and then you read the story of Atrahasis, the Akkadian story of Atrahasis, or you read the Gilgamesh epic, 11, you'll very quickly see that these two texts have a lot in common. And the Akkadian story probably has its origin, its written form, probably in the 17th century, 18th century BCE. So long before the biblical text was written. And there's a Sumerian story, flood story, that goes earlier than that. Probably a little bit earlier in the early second millennium. So, for me, it was the combination of seeing that the biblical text, particularly the Old Testament, were not unique in what they wrote, and then seeing from a historical aspect and an archaeological aspect problems with the Philistines, or problems with, from an archaeological standpoint, the conquest account, and how Jericho doesn't have the destruction layer that we need, or the city of Ai doesn't have the destruction that we need for either a 14th century or, a late 15th century or a 1200 destruction, conquest. It's just, in other words, it was all of these things started to pile up on me. And I remember, I think it was probably at the end of the first semester, near the end of the first semester, I threw in the towel and I said, well, if this historical thing isn't right, and this archaeological thing proves that this historical thing didn't happen, and the flood account, came from a story 1,000 years earlier, 1,200 years earlier, maybe more, well, then this whole is all just must be hooey, right? And I became a pretty hardline atheist. Like, there is no God. That's what I said. There is no God. Not that I was like an activist with it or anything, but there's no God. And I'll stop after this, but there was a friend of mine that went to seminary with me. His name was Mark, and Mark was such a good friend to me. If anybody doesn't know, Johns Hopkins is in Baltimore City, and I have a lot of anxiety issues, and I don't like driving in the city. I just hate it. So I would park. I had an apartment up there that I rented out I'd stay up there during the week, and then I'd drive back home to Winchester, Virginia, where I lived. And I would park Sunday afternoon, and I wouldn't move until Friday when I left. And so I wouldn't leave the city, and I was just very. I think he could sense that I was feeling a little trapped. He would drive up every Thursday and pick me up after my epigraphy class, and he would drive me down to Uno's Pizzeria, and we would have an Uno's pizza, and of course he was he was an evangelical Christian, and he would sort of throughout the rest of that first year, he kind of kept trying to pull me back from going into further and further into atheism, which I'm not saying that that's a bad thing to go into atheism, but I mean from his perspective that was a bad thing to do. And I think probably by the end of the first year I had kind of calmed down a little bit. That's not the right way to say that, but thought it through, I guess, a little bit more and settled into like a soft agnosticism. So
yeah, so we'll start with this one question is, I don't want to get too much into the weeds in all of this, but a lot of the things you talked about regarding kind of your deconversion were things that were referenced in the Old Testament passages. Did you have any sort of like similar doubts regarding like the New Testament and like the stories of Jesus and the epistles and all those things? Was that part of your deconversion, or was it mostly like kind of looking at these Old Testament things and seeing they didn't add up in your eyes?
Yeah. It's interesting. If anybody knows me or watches anything that I say online, I'm like this in person too. I'm very I'm very hesitant to talk about things that I don't feel like I have any expertise in. And I think the same is true in my thoughts. So, I had gotten a master's in theology in Old Testament studies. I'd taken 6 years of Greek. I'd translated through Hebrews. I'd translated through all these really difficult passages. But it wasn't my major, So because of that, I think I have this thing in my brain where it's like, well, that's not your major. And if you haven't spent significant, time at some elite level, at least more than I had, that it wasn't really something that I needed to wade into or should wade into. Anyway, so that being said, because of my fundamentalist view, the entirety of the biblical text was the inspired word of God. So I guess what was good for the goose was good for the gander, right? If there were all these problems in the Hebrew Bible, well, that's it. I don't really need to look further, right? Because God was supposed to preserve the entirety of the text. So yeah, and the thing is, I haven't really given the rest of my my educational trajectory, I suppose, focusing on the Hebrew Bible and other ancient Near Eastern literature, things like the resurrection haven't really come into my purview. So, actually, maybe a couple months ago, I thought, what, people were sort of pushing me, Josh, I want you to do some reading in the secondary literature on the resurrection, read about the resurrection. And so I started to try to make time to do it. And so I actually put out on Twitter, all right, give me the books that you guys would recommend for reading about the resurrection. Because, when I was at seminary, I read all about it, right? But I read it with a positive mindset. So, I remember I taught Sunday school. I pastored a church for 7 years. I probably should have mentioned that, but I pastored a church for 7 years. And I went through all the evidences for the resurrection and all the arguments. And does the swoon theory hold up? And, does the missing body hold up? I knew all the arguments, but from a pro mindset. I'd never looked at them from a negative mindset. And, to be honest, I haven't done that yet. It's probably a lame excuse or a silly excuse, but I just don't have a lot of time to do that. So anyway.
Yeah. Having not a lot of time is a common thing among people, especially in America, that I've seen. So you talked about how you kind of settled into like a soft agnosticism. I'm guessing it's kind of similar to where you're at now. Have your beliefs changed since you talked about how you kind of like settled into this soft agnostic belief?
It's a good question. I think probably the answer is, let me say it this way. People asked me, what was it like to go to a liberal, I guess they say it more like, well, of course you don't believe in God. You went to Johns Hopkins liberal school. And people are often very surprised to hear that many of the faculty in my department are Christian, right? And that sort of strikes this weird chord with people. Wait a minute, but all those people would say that, that they would say the documentary hypothesis or some redaction form of the Hebrew Bible. That's it's a valid way to look at the formation of the Pentateuch or the formation of the biblical text, the Hebrew Bible. And so then they say, well, wait a minute, what did they say when you went through Ezekiel? You translated through Ezekiel. What did they say about Ezekiel 26? And it was like, what? It didn't really come up. It's not really important because one's belief to the greatest extent possible, I think people try to keep their theological hat over here and their academic hat over here, and try not to let the two influence one another. Well, at least one direction. But so I haven't. It really kind of went on the. I don't even know that it went on the back burner. It just stopped being an issue for me. Now that being said, I had probably my best friend, who's also an evangelical, was at Hopkins with me. And I won't say his name, but he's doing a postdoc. I think he's still out there doing a postdoc at Cambridge at Tyndale. But he's an Assyriologist, graduated the year after I did, and brilliant scholar. But he's still an evangelical. He went to Trinity out in Illinois, and he dealt with a lot of the things before he got to Hopkins that I dealt with when I got to Hopkins. And we had conversations incessantly while we were translating through Sumerian texts. We'd sit there at 5 a.m. in the library, and I'd say, how do you know that what you're feeling, because it would always come back to a subjective experience, right? I believe that, I've had personal experiences with Jesus Christ, and I can tell that the Holy Spirit is interacting with me. And so how do you know that that's not Enki? And how do you know that's not Enlil? And so those are the conversations that we would have. But no, I would say I've just probably stayed in a similar place because it hasn't been terribly important to me to move.
Okay.
I guess.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair. I'm not going to try to force you into some corner on you have to believe this. I think that's a mistake a lot of people make. So I'd love to talk to you a little bit about, you talk about how you haven't seen a good reason to believe in God. Obviously, it's one thing you could reject Christianity and still be some sort of a deist or maybe even a pantheist, even though it's a little bit different, something along those lines. So two parts to this. We'll just start with the first part. Why did you go all the way to where you're at now, where you don't see a reason to believe in God?
I think that a lot of it has to do with, and again, talking my opinion here, I think for me, a lot of it has to do with, I see, for example, given that I can read this ancient Near Eastern literature, and I can read these Sumerian and Akkadian texts, and I can read Ugaritic texts, and of course read the Hebrew, and then see how people interacted with what they considered to be the divine throughout history. Seeing the similarities, seeing how things develop, seeing how those mythological texts were used to further people's own purposes. I guess in the end, I kind of came down on, well, I don't see the necessity of a supernatural explanation for these things. And it's interesting to me because I think that most Christians that I have interacted with would say that, at least initially, about Sumerian mythological texts or Akkadian mythological texts. Most people would say, if I were to say, do you think that those are divinely inspired? Well, no, they're not divinely inspired. If they're pressed, they might think and say, well, maybe Satan inspired them or something. But, most Christians that I know don't have a problem saying, no, Atrahasis isn't, a story that's inspired by God. No deity, I suppose, required for Atrahasis. Right, no deity required for Enkian and Horsak, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, or any of these other stories. And I guess that's where I kind of landed with the Hebrew Bible, and ultimately, I suspect with the New Testament text as well, that a natural explanation, like a human explanation, I don't want to say suffices, but I mean, like it can be, I think, well explained with natural processes. So, like, I don't know that I'm at a place where I would say there is no God, like from an epistemological standpoint. Like, I know there's no God, but I just, there's nothing that I've been confronted with to date that I've said, I can't really, not that I can't explain it, because I don't know anything about Big Bang cosmology or, what Planck time or whatever. Like, I've told you more than I know about it. So I couldn't explain, how that came to be. But given what I've seen, I suppose inductively, I would conclude that it's more likely that it has some natural explanation that I don't know, or we don't know as humans. I don't know.
Okay, I think that's fair. Is there anything? What would, if anything, would convince you that maybe there is a reason to believe in some sort of like theism?
Yeah. I mean, let me say from the outset of this question that I hate that I don't have my faith anymore. I hate it. And I've said that online before, and I think it's worth saying again. So you're not looking at or listening to someone who is like shaking their fist at the God of the Old Testament. I hate that I lost my faith, because there's a comfort that I don't have anymore. Now maybe that will come in time, that a new comfort will come. But I mean, this is for 25, 26 years. This was the core of my being, and so I wish that I were convinced of it. So that being said, yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I'd like to say, having an experience with the numinous, with the divine, to such an extent that it would convince me, God appearing before me. I mean, these are all very, I'm sure, standard responses to that question, but I don't know, right? I mean, would my brain? What is that movie where? Gosh, I can't remember her name, but she gets a signal, like a message from outer space, and they build this ship based on those instructions, and she spins around, this thing spins around the ship, and she goes to some other galaxy or something, and when she comes back, it's, people say, look, you've been gone 2 seconds, like you weren't gone, right? You've always been here. She's absolutely convinced that she's had this experience, but then she wrestles with it. Was it all hallucinations? I mean, I don't know if that would be where I would land, right? Because we live in a different day than the apostles did. So yeah, I don't know. That's a good question that I don't know that I have a good answer to. Sorry.
Oh, on a different note, the people in the live chat are saying contact with Jodie Foster. Does that ring a bell for you?
Yes, that's it. That is it. Yeah, absolutely.
Hey,
Contact.
we may not solve the existence of God today, but we did identify
We know
that.
the movie.
I'm terrible with movies. Luckily, there's people listening who know what's up. So, kind of a similar question, and I'm guessing obviously you would become a Christian if you were convinced that Christianity is true based on what you've said beforehand.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, kind of a similar question, and I'm guessing it's going to be somewhat of a similar response. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on what would convince you that Christianity is true.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. So, okay. I think I've come to a place where inerrancy wouldn't be an issue for me. Like, so let's take Megan for an example. I hope she doesn't mind me saying this. You know, Megan is a Christian. She's an Anglican, and inerrancy is not something that she holds to, or is. She was surprised that was a thing when she came to the States. So, like, that's not an issue for her. The nature of inspiration, not a question that she really wrestles with. But Jesus Christ is her Lord and Savior, and again, I don't want to speak for her. It's probably not a good thing for me to do, but Jesus is really at the core, right? And so all of these other issues sort of melt away. They're not really problematic for her. So if you were to say to her, "Oh, have you thought about Q?" Or is there marking priority or something like it's just, why what? Like, why would I even care about that? Or does it bother you that Romans 5:1, it could be in the subjunctive or could be in the indicative, like, let us have peace with God, or we have peace with God. Does that really bother you? Does it keep you up at night? No, it doesn't keep her up at night. And that's probably the type of Christian that I would be, right? And so I suspect at this stage, it would be more about a personal experience, I think. Yeah. I think it would have to be a personal experience, but that's not a very satisfying answer, is it?
I mean,
Sorry.
I appreciate your honesty. Your honesty is the most, not trying to be cheesy, but your honesty is the most satisfying answer to me. So you talked about this like idea of a personal. I don't know how much you really know what this personal experience would be like, but like you talk about this personal experience. What kind of personal experience would you be like? Okay, I guess this whole Christianity thing is true.
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of couch it in what my experience used to be. So I asked the friend that I was talking about earlier. I asked him, like, how do you know that Jesus exists? How do you know that Christ died for your sins? How do you know that that's real? And he said, I can't explain how I know that, but I know it like I know the sun's going to come up tomorrow. And I think that when I was a Christian, from a doctrinal standpoint, I was incredibly orthodox, right? And I had a walk with Christ. And when I say that, what I mean is I would wake up in the morning, and if I was having a bad morning or if I was having a bad day, I could pray, and I could. It always sounds weird to say I could feel that comfort, but like I could sense that connection that I had with God, and I knew that the Holy Spirit was inside of me and was working things together for good. But one of the things that I think was most disturbing to me in the end of my sort of journey into agnosticism was that for probably a year, maybe more, after I deconverted, I would periodically still pray, and it was mostly for comfort. But it was also the prayers that I had were I'd be driving down the road and I'd say, God, if I've got this all wrong, I'm really sorry. Like, if you're there, let me know somehow. Those sorts of prayers, and I always still felt that comfort. I still felt that connection to God. And then one day I didn't. One day I prayed, and it was the same kind of prayer. And it had been, 3-4 months since I'd done it, and there was just no connection, and it was disturbing to me. And while that all sounds very, I don't know, strange to somebody maybe that hasn't trusted Christ for their salvation, it's a very real thing to sense. I don't know, and I don't want to sound charismatic in any way, but like to sense the Holy Spirit, to sense. Yeah, but it's not a physical sense. I don't know how to describe it. Yeah, it's bad for me to try to describe it because I don't know how. But yeah. So I guess given that, I just don't know. I don't know that would do it anymore. I think it would have to be like something tangible. Tangible is not even the right word, but I don't know, something that I could actually see and hear. Yeah, I don't know.
No, I think it's a good answer. It's something that I can relate to. There's been times where, obviously I'm a Christian, so I believe things differently than you do. But there's been times where I felt like, kind of this like something missing almost a little bit in your prayer. So I totally understand where you're coming from with what you're saying. I'm curious, trying to think where I want to take this. There's so much that we could talk about.
Wherever you want to go, man. If you can dump what we were going to talk about later, man. Go wherever you want to
go. Yeah, I'm trying to figure that out. So what do you think of like other people who have claimed to have not necessarily just like a feeling, but like have like seen, like, for example, there's a lot of Muslims who would say they've had dreams where they've seen Jesus, and it's kind of led them from Islam, like the Nabil Qureshi, a famous example, and there's been many more other Muslims in the same line. Things that many people would say that they've seen, like, or experienced Christ in ways that cannot be explained, and it must be God, and that kind of led them to a belief in Christianity. So how do you look at these things from your perspective?
Yeah, if you'd asked me that 15 years ago, my response would have been Satan at work. Not Satan at work, God at work. Sorry, thinking the other direction initially. Somebody being led away into Islam, but no. It's God at work, and the movement of the Holy Spirit, and He's drawing people to Himself. I don't like. So I really don't like it when people tell me why I've deconverted. It's frustrating to me. It's frustrating to me when people tell me that I was never saved. Generally speaking, the people that tell me that I was never saved don't seem to understand the gospel terribly well. That doesn't mean that there's not a case to be made in 1 John for that sort of thing, but it's just been my experience. But they're very quick to tell me that I was never saved, and it seems like it's for a comfort for themselves to tell me that I was never saved, which is fine for them. I don't like it because it seems like it's very intrusive. You don't know my heart, not you, Zach, but that person doesn't know my heart.
I totally get what you're saying.
So I tend to be hesitant to think too much about people's spiritual experiences because I think that could be real, right? I don't know. That being said, if you pressed me and you said, all right, gun to your head, Josh, you got to tell me, what do you think this is? I guess that I would say, I think that the human brain is very complex, and people have experiences in life that lead them to see and hear things, which is one of the reasons that I'm even hesitant myself to say, well, if I saw something, then I would believe. I don't even know that that's true. So yeah, I mean, I suspect there could be a very good natural explanation for those sorts of things. And I think that would extend to things like the miraculous, Craig Keener's monster book on, the miraculous. I think that those things probably have a good natural explanation, but who am I to make that determination? So I'm thinking of somebody in particular, and I won't mention their name, but they're pretty popular here on social media, and they say that they heard a voice, they heard the voice of God, and like there's no way that I would pass judgment on whether they did or not. So maybe they did. And really, there's a part of me deep down that says, "But I hope they did," and I hope that's a God that's going to speak to me someday. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of really interesting stuff here that you bring up. So I'm curious. You talked a little bit about how you can get frustrated when Christians will say, "Hey, you were never saved," or things like that. So what do you think of like a passage like Romans 1 where it talks about like where a lot of people say, if you're not a Christian, you're suppressing the truth of the knowledge of God and things like that. How do you look at that from your perspective?
I mean, I think that now stepping sort of into my I don't think that the New Testament texts are divinely inspired position. Early Christianity, and again, outside of my field of expertise, so just say that at the outset. I say that a lot, Zach. Sorry.
No, you're good. You're all good.
But I suspect, early Christians, I mean, if you look at 1 John 2, for example, I think it's 1 John 2, but you have, and not just 1 John, obviously, you've got it. What in 2 Peter? I think it's 2 Peter. I've started to lose track of I haven't done New Testament studies in 10 years, but you have one of the big things that you see seemingly in early Christianity is people leaving the faith, right? Some people leaving the faith because of the cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, I think that gets worse. Of course, I'm not a New Testament historian, but you definitely seem to have people in the New Testament text that seems like they're dealing with communities where people are leaving the faith, right? And there's got to be a way to say to the faithful. I mean, you see this in the Maccabean era. I think you see this in the book of Daniel. There's hold fast, right? Stand firm. Don't lose the faith. I mean, look at the book of Hebrews, right? I'm not telling you anything you don't know, Zach, but just for people listening, maybe that don't know, the book of Hebrews is look at these Hebrews 11. Like, look at these people that's this great cloud of witnesses that stood firm in the faith, and they didn't even get to see the things that they were hoping for. And yet they held firm in their faith. And I think that when you see someone defect, there's got to be a rationale for that, because in particular, the Pauline doctrine seems to be that people are sealed by the Holy Spirit of promise, right? That their salvation is sure. And so how is it this sort of paradox, right? Where you've got somebody like me, I had a conversation with a pastor online a couple months ago, and he was being very antagonistic with me. I don't feel like I'm an antagonistic person. Maybe I am, and I just don't know it. But, you were never saved. You were never saved. And I said, look, here's what I believed. You tell me if I was saved. And I laid out in 5 tweets the gospel that I believed and whereby I was saved, to try to keep it with Paul. And, in the end, he said, oh, well, I mean, it sounds like you were. Well, you're just apostate. You're just, falling away from the faith. I don't know why I can't pronounce apostasy. But you'll come back. You'll come back to the faith. You're not you haven't lost your salvation. You were saved. So yeah, it's this. For him, it was seemed pretty clearly to be a defense mechanism, right? Like, you were never saved, but yeah, by your standards, I was, right? By my standards, I was. Oh, well, then you're still saved, right? You'll come back to the faith. There's a way to deal with someone leaving your community of faith in such a way, to deal with it in such a way that you don't lose heart. They went out from us because they were never of us, right? And I think that's the message that you get. So when you look at something, to bring it back to Romans 1, sorry, I think this is the rationale, right? You have this natural theology that Paul is talking about. You see it in places like Psalm 19, and you say, okay, God is the God of creation. God shows himself in his great majesty. Psalm 104, he pushes back the waters, right? He's the God of creation. He demonstrates his power, his presence, and all these things. And so man can't help but see his glory, and know of his existence just by looking around at the created world and the created order. And I think Paul picks up on this, right? And so I think, because, I mean, again, all this, Zach. I feel like I'm just talking to the audience that might not know this, but when you think about Paul's dealing there in Romans with how is it that people are all guilty before God? How are the Jews guilty before God? How are the Gentiles guilty before God? How's everybody guilty before God? The whole world stands guilty before him. And how can that be? How about those that haven't heard? And I think that because of this paradox, where you've got a question of, what about the people that haven't heard? And how does God hold them responsible? How did God hold people responsible before the law? How could they be condemned before the law? And I think all of these things deal with this. And I'll stop preaching. Sorry.
You're good. You're good.
But I think all of these things, Paul is using to say, God has thought about all this. God has taken care of all of this. And so if you have people that that are either in unbelief or have never come to belief, they are suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. They're holding that truth down. So they are at fault. It's not that they don't know enough to believe. It's that they do know, and because God's revealed it to them. Look around. Nobody can deny that. They just suppress it because they want to live in sin, right? They want to do all these horrible things that he talks about there, Romans. So, I think that's a natural, from my perspective, that's a natural response of somebody that's trying to explain how this sort of paradox can actually, work out, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, yeah. So I'm curious about so obviously you're an agnostic and your wife's an Anglican Christian. So how do you think you guys can look at, you're both, I mean, you got your doctorate in Assyriology, and I know she's pursuing her doctorate in Assyriology. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? So so similar course load, similar like studies that you guys have done, how do you think you guys can look at kind of like the similar writing, similar studies, similar things, and come to different conclusions? Like,
yeah, I think that's a fair question. And again, I think that looking at her as an Anglican, and then looking at my friend who maintains an evangelical position, and I think that, because I've asked him that. I haven't really asked her that because it's not as much of a. I think I understand her mindset a little bit better, just because I live with her. But
that would help.
But I remember asking him, like, I said, about Mesopotamian religion. You know about all these things that I know about, and he said, yeah, I mean, it's true. the Sumerian flood story long predates the biblical flood story. And yes, the biblical writers are, utilizing the Atrahasis flood story. And in fact, you can see it in other parts of Genesis. In the creation account, you can see parallels to it. But it's a faith position that he has, and it's a faith position that my wife has. And I think that, and again, not wanting to speak for them, but I think that they have faith. See, here's the thing. I guess maybe this is a better way to say it. Is it possible? One of the things that Skylar and I talk about all the time, Skylar Fiction on our channel, on his channel, sorry, not on our channel, on his channel, is that, sorry, I'm just going to turn the air conditioning down because I'm dying.
Am I grilling you that hard that you're like sweating?
No, it's the house. We've got these eco-friendly thermostats or something. So at a certain time, they kick up, to be, and of course it went from the temperature. I have MS, and so heat kills me, and they kicked up to a really high temperature to save. Anyway, I don't know why I'm talking about all this. And now I forgot what I was saying.
We were talking about faith and stuff along that lines, and how your friend and your wife can come to a different conclusion, but I think different. Mm-hmm.
That's right. So, like on Skylar's channel, we talk a lot about. We'll have theists come on, and we'll talk about things like, 1 Samuel 15 with the Amalekites, for example, or the conquest account, or any of these other things where it seems like there's a contradiction within the biblical text itself, right? How can a loving God who commands love your neighbor as yourself also command the wiping out of an indigenous people group? And ultimately, very, very often, the response is, and I think it's a perfectly fine response, well, God, we can't understand his ways, right? There's mystery to the divine, and God's ways are higher than ours, and so he has morally justified reasons that we just can't know. And I think that ultimately that's a possibility, right? I think that's possible when you think about the problem of evil. I think that's a possible understanding that can make logical sense, right? That God just has these morally justified reasons that he hasn't revealed to us, or that free will requires agents that are going to sin, and so that's I think those things are possible. I think, to me, they're not adequate explanations. I don't think that they're probable, and I wonder if they do think that they're probable. But again, I think it ultimately doesn't come down to the data. We all have the same data. For example, my friend at Hopkins, I remember, my friend from Hopkins, I remember we went to a conference, and I told him that we were sitting there having a beer, and I said, it's funny, I was telling him about the Digital Hammurabi channel, and I said, I just did a video on the prophecy in Ezekiel 26, the failed prophecy in Ezekiel 26. And he said, why? And I said, I don't know. But like, there are a lot of videos out there talking about, all the reasons why, and I don't mean to offend anybody here, but all the reasons why it wasn't a failed prophecy, that, it's talking about Alexander the Great, or it's, these many nations in Ezekiel 26. And he was like, that's a weird position. Of course it was a failed prophecy. And he says it in chapter 29, right? But he's an evangelical Christian. How is it that an evangelical Christian can say that Ezekiel 26 is a failed prophecy? Failed prophecy. Well, because that's not part of his belief, right? He doesn't need Isaiah 53 or Isaiah 7:14 in their original context to refer to Jesus, right? They referred to, near antecedents. They're near reference, and he would just say that God intended them to have, a later reference. But the problems that I, as a fundamentalist Christian, had big problems with, things that I had big problems with. Ezekiel 26 couldn't be a failed prophecy. No way, because that would mean Ezekiel's not a real prophet, and that would bring the whole system crashing down. And for him, those aren't issues. So I think that he allows the data to be what it is, and he has a different structure, a different faith structure that allows for those things.
Okay. This has been a great discussion. I think the title of this was actually Understanding the Old Testament from an Agnostic Perspective. So I don't think we got into too much of that, but I mean, maybe another time.
I'd love to come back on if you want me to.
I've really enjoyed this conversation. We'll conclude with one last question. Let's just say that Christianity is true, and you kind of stay where you're at. You don't believe in this resurrection, and you come to face God. And let's just say you would have become a Christian, but if you believed it was true, but you just where you're at. Sorry, I can't talk. You're at where you are now. You just don't believe, and God's gonna judge according to the Bible, and people who don't believe will be sent to hell, whatever exactly that means. What would, I mean, it's a vague question, it's a broad question, but what are kind of your thoughts if Christianity is true and you're wrong about it, but you wanted to convert? If you can get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I definitely can. It's a scary thought, right? It's a scary thing to think about. And it's funny because if you were to ask me something like, well, what if it turns out that Allah is actually the true God? That doesn't strike the same chord with me, right? Because I didn't grow up as a Muslim. I grew up as an evangelical Christian. So, I had the same feeling actually, and I'll answer it better. But I had the same feeling in the middle of seminary. I had really started to, I'd mastered Hebrew. I was starting to do Targumic Aramaic. I'd taken Biblical Aramaic and I was moving into Targumic Aramaic. So I was reading from Targum Onkelos, and I was really getting into trying to understand Jewish perspective and the Jewish background. And I remember one night walking around outside and thinking to myself, I had gone into a chat room. I don't know if they still have those, but I'd gone into a chat room and I was talking with an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. And he was saying, you don't understand the text that you're reading. And as I was saying, well, you don't understand the text that you're reading. And in the end, I remember walking around outside going, what if I'm wrong? What if that Jewish rabbi is right? And I mean, it really bothered me that night. And I guess this sounds strange, but given what I believed about the eternal security of the believer, part of me would say, this sounds bad, but I'm good, right? I've been sealed by the Holy Spirit of promise unto the day of redemption. I can't escape his hand, right? So I'm just a backslidden Christian under that theological position. I guess one of the things that I think about this is that as I said before, I would love for Christianity to be true. Not necessarily all of the aspects of Christianity that I held to, because I think there are some very hateful aspects of Christianity that I held to out of necessity, the way that I understood the text. But I don't. As much as one can feel comfortable doing this, I feel like I have cried out since my deconversion. And I don't know what more I can do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a very candid answer. I mean, I think that if C.S. Lewis's theology is correct about the people that go to hell are people that would want to be there. I mean, and what you're saying is true, and I have no reason to doubt. Like, who am I to judge some person on the internet that I barely know on their deepest intentions of their heart? Then I think it just brings a lot of interesting thoughts and discussion. But I mean, we're gonna have to start to wrap things up now. I've really appreciated your time. This has been a great conversation/interview. I've really enjoyed kind of learning from you. So just for people who maybe don't follow you, just plugs what you do, things like this. If they want to follow more of your work, where do they go?
Yeah, sure. Digital Hammurabi is who we are. DigitalHammurabi.com. We have a Digital Hammurabi YouTube channel. My wife and I have written a couple of books. I don't know why we always have them sitting here, but because we're both Assyriologists, we Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian, the Introduction for Complete Beginners. So if you're interested in learning Sumerian and learning how to read all those cool inscriptions, you can. The topic that we were going to talk about tonight, did the Old Testament endorse slavery? I think the link is in the description.
It is.
And I have a book forthcoming, should be in the next couple of months coming out. It's publication, a popular level publication of my dissertation. And that is called, what's the title we came up with? Sorry. Learning to Pray in a Dead Language, Education and Invocation in Ancient Mesopotamia. So it's about ancient schools and how priests prayed in 4,000 years ago to the gods in Mesopotamia. So sorry, I read something in the side chat. I've made it a point to not read things in the side chat, but Gavin, that was really mean of you. So thank you for that. Sorry. Anyway, I'm going to stop reading stuff in the side chat.
Okay. Well, I'll add one thing in the side chat that's kind of funny, and we can kind of end on this lighthearted note. From Darth Calculus, he says, if you ever have a promotion code for the sale of your books, please call it the code of digital Hammurabi. So we'll close on that. We'll close with a happier side chat notice. Dr. Josh, I really appreciated this conversation. Any last thoughts before we wrap things up here?
No, I really appreciate you having me on. I think these kinds of conversations are really, really important because honestly, I think both polarized sides of, this Christian atheist or whatever, skeptic debate often think a lot of things about the other side that maybe aren't necessarily true. And that other side responds in kind. And it's not that there's not a place for all that stuff because we all need entertainment, I guess. But I think these kinds of conversations are nice. And I just really appreciated you having me on. So,
yeah, you're always welcome. It's been a great conversation. And I really do enjoy learning from atheists and trying to understand why they believe what they believe, or agnostics in your case, not just trying to make these broad stereotypes to generalize millions of people, because every person is individual and we have our own beliefs. So, yeah, I appreciate this conversation, Dr. Josh. As for Adherent Apologetics, if you are new here, I encourage you to subscribe, whether you're listening via YouTube or the podcast. You can follow us at Twitter at Adherent Apologetics, at AA Apologetics. You can look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and now, unfortunately, but I felt the need to do it, TikTok at Adherent Apologetics. Yeah, that's the thing now, I guess. It's the world we live in. So
it is.
I gotta tell you, I don't know how old your kids are, but be careful with that TikTok. It can be interesting what you can find yourself into.
Yeah. TikTok. No, I know. Crazy.
Yeah. And then you can support us at patreon.com/adherentapologetics. We just reached 50% funding today. It's exciting.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you. So every donation helps. And that's it, Dr. Josh. Thank you for your time. I'm sure this won't be the last time I talk to you.
Awesome.
All right. Have a good night.